Holy Gospel according to St. John, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus said to the disciples, I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own, but will speak whatever he hears, and he will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. For this reason, I said that he will take what is mine and declare it to you. The Gospel of the Lord. So as many of you know, I am deeply into woodworking. And while I was on sabbatical last winter, I had opportunities, besides skiing and reading, which is the things I was supposed to be doing, I had opportunities to play around in my friend's wood shop. And he has a large shop and he's got a lathe. And so I got an opportunity to play around some more on wood turning. And I had used his lathe before when I had been out there, and I had made a couple of pens and a couple of other things that were really beyond my skill level. But this time I had many more opportunities to play with the lathe, and I became intrigued with all the things that I could do artistically if I was able to master this skill. And so I came back from sabbatical thinking to myself, among other things, I gotta get me a lathe. But I did this with eyes wide open because I realized that getting a lathe was going to be a lot more complex and a lot bigger thing than just buying a piece of equipment. I realized, because I had talked to my friend enough, that buying a lathe was going to require some significant investment. And one of the first things he told me was, he says, when you go to wood shows, people will guys selling lathes will have the things set up and say, hey, you want to come over here and try to turn a pen? And somebody comes in and you go over and any idiot can do this. And it's fun, and he says it's like the gateway drug of lathes. Because people think, oh wow, this is easy, and you don't realize that the real investment in that is not buying the lathe, it's all the stuff you gotta buy to use the lathe, and all this space you need and all the other kind of stuff. And I realized that anything that I was gonna do was gonna require some significant investment. I also realized it was gonna require some significant learning. I was going to have to learn how to do something that is totally unlike anything else I'd ever done in wood turning, in woodworking. Turning is where the wood moves and you keep the tools steady, which is backwards from everything else that I do. So I was going to have to, I am spending now more time reading things, watching YouTube videos and stuff like that. And of course, no matter what sport or hobby you might be into, you realize there are a lot of things that you can look at them, read about them, watch them on YouTube, and practice is a lot more complicated than theory. So this is going to require a lot of practice and a lot of actually developing the skill. In fact, as with any of my other woodworking skills, if I want to keep up with this, I'm going to constantly have to do all of those things. As I do that with the kind of woodworking skills I have now, they always require investment, more learning, more practice. But in the end, I am happy to do those things because the experience is worth it. In fact, any activity in our lives that becomes meaningful or fulfilling or gives us any sense of joy requires personal investment and continuous learning and active practice and work. And that is true also of any meaningful relationship in our lives. Any real and meaningful relationship you have with anybody else requires both people investing themselves in the relationship, actively working to learn about each other, and actively working together to make that relationship work. And we're willing to do those things in relationships that give meaning and purpose and joy to our lives. And that same thing about relationships is also true about our relationship with God. It is absolutely true that God loves us and creates a relationship with us purely because of his love for us and not because of anything that we have done or anything that we have the potential to do in the future. God does this by investing himself in our lives, by listening and learning about us all the time and our cares and our wants and our needs. And he does it by actively sharing his love in our lives. But it's also true that that relationship cannot be meaningful or fulfilling in our lives unless we also are willing to invest ourselves in that relationship with God. And unless we're willing to grow in learning about God's love and presence, and to actively work on that relationship in our daily lives. And that, like any woodworking skill I have, is a continual process that goes on throughout our lives. It never ends. But sometimes people figure out that, they've got this God stuff all kind of figured out. We've read some good Bible stories, important Bible stories. We have learned a couple of good theological words like salvation and redemption and forgiveness and whatever other things. And we have some good catchphrases that are true, like love God and love others. Jesus talks about that. Those are all good things. But sometimes we end up like the person that goes to a wood show, learns how to turn a pen, and figures, I got it all figured out now. This is all I ever need to learn. But we don't have it all down. And growing in our relationship and our understanding of God is something that is never finished in our lives. So today, we celebrate Trinity Sunday, which is dedicated to a seemingly impossible thing. That the one God is three persons, but the three persons are really one God. And in some ways, if that doesn't really make sense, then that is the point. This day reminds us that anytime we think that we're done and that we've got God all figured out, we're missing the point. In today's gospel reading, Jesus addresses his disciples right before he goes to the cross. He had been with them for 3 years. He had taught them. He had trained them. And in some respects, you might expect that he would say to them, to the disciples, I have trained you, I have taught you, now you know what to do. You know how to go do it. Just go out there, trust your instincts, and get it done. But that is not what Jesus says. In fact, at first glance, it's kind of depressing. He says, I have many things to tell you, but you can't even bear them now. Ouch. Sort of like, wow. After 3 years, you can't even listen to stuff? But on the other hand, Jesus doesn't leave it there. He tells them that God is not finished with them. He tells them that God will never be finished with them. The Spirit is coming and is going to guide them into all truth. And that means that the disciples are people who are going to continue to experience God's active investment in their lives. They are going to continue to be people who God listens to and understands. They are going to be people who continue to experience God's active presence and love in their lives. And so what Jesus is calling them to is not to be people who have degrees that say, now I've got God all figured out, but rather to be people who are absolutely invested in that relationship with God. And that has real-life consequences for how they live their lives if they are going to invest in that relationship, and it does for us too. Investment is important in any relationship we have for God. And sometimes people will talk to me about, like, I wonder, where God is in my life, and sometimes people aren't doing the investment. And some of the first investment that I thought about this when I was thinking about the lathe. The first investment I had to figure out was how to make space for the lathe in my shop, because I don't have space. So I had to rearrange things in the shop, and I had to condense things. I had to get rid of some things that I didn't need anymore, which was why yard sale was good. But I think sometimes the first and most important investment we need to make in our relationship with God is to make space for God in our lives. We are almost all of us very busy people. We live in a world in which there's always something else going on. And how do you make space to listen to God, for God to actually be experienced by you in your life? Just showing up this morning and being part of a group of people who actively listens and makes the time and the space is part of that. But I think that's really one of the key first parts. Whenever we look in confirmation at the Ten Commandments and we study the Sabbath, honoring the Sabbath, I've asked the rabbi from Sherry Torah to come over, and Rabbi Jacob always talks about what it means from a Jewish perspective to honor the Sabbath. And he says, for us, it's not really about, you have to go to the synagogue, you have to go. It's about making time, making space, opening yourself up so that you can listen to what God is saying in your life, making space for God that usually isn't there the rest of the days of the week. Sometimes that's part of the investment, but investment like that is important if we're going to actually have a meaningful and joyful experience of God in our lives. And when Jesus called his disciples to be people who actively participated in that relationship with God, he called them to be people who were committed to lifelong learning. You know, he makes it clear that the disciples, he's going to keep teaching the disciples through the Spirit, but that means that they've got to be open to listening, open to learning. And that's true for us too. You know, sometimes we end up thinking, well, I've read this story, I know this story, you know, what more is there? And it's the conversation with one another through which God works to help us deepen our appreciation of, you know, how does like this biblical text, how does it address me differently today than it did yesterday? There are probably many times that you have remembered me or Pastor Christine getting up and saying, you know what, every year we have to preach the same text, and we've been doing it for 30 years now. I've been doing it for 30 years. And I have this feeling of, you know, I have learned everything I could possibly learn about this text, but in fact, as I start to study it more, and I start to listen, and I start to read other people, and I talk to other pastors about it, I frequently learn something new that I didn't, or I see it from a different perspective that I have not before. And that's the way it is, or can be, for all of us, when we're committed to actually going beyond just the kind of things that we learned before. That's what Jesus called his first disciples to, and that's what Jesus calls us to as well. And like those first disciples, Jesus calls us also to be people who are dedicated to practicing our faith in real life. Jesus sent the disciples out into the world to do actual real things in the lives of actual real people. And for us too, this means moving beyond kind of simple catchphrases like, well, you know, I live my faith by loving God and loving others. That's great, because Jesus says, you know, when he's asked, you know, what are the greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. Good. How does that actually work itself out in your daily life? How does it work itself out in my daily life? What does it mean by the actual actions I take, the way that I spend my money, the attitudes that I project towards others, the decisions I make about where I'm going to go and how I'm going to spend my time? Those are questions that each one of us needs to ask each day of our lives. And they're not always going to, the answer is not always going to be the same for each one of us or for each day. But actually engaging in those kinds of activities is often the way we grow in that relationship with God. So, you know, we're talking about, we're going to pray over our Honduras mission trip people. Almost always, when people go on a trip, and you don't need to go on a trip to do this, but almost always when people invest themselves in that kind of service, people come back and say, you know what, I felt like God was actually working through me when I went on that trip and I worked with these folks. And it's not that God's not working with you in other times, but you become more aware of it. And that's what adds joy and meaning and purpose to life and to a relationship with God, when you actually know that it's happening and you're not just talking about it. The thing is about this day is that our relationship with God is bigger and more complex than we can ever comprehend in any of our lifetimes. And a real and meaningful relationship with God always defies easy answers or simplistic understandings. And even though it's a gift, if we want to get anything out of this gift, it requires constant investment and learning and practice in our lives. But in the end, that investment and learning and practice are worth it, because a real and living relationship with God brings meaning, purpose, and joy to our lives. A real and living relationship with God builds confidence in God's love in the midst of the chaos that so often surrounds us. And a real and meaningful relationship with God makes God's love an actual experience in our lives, and not just a